We're on 42a. 42a, we just got started with the Gemara talking about three different Lashonos shel Zahoris, so three different red strings. One belonging to the Para Aduma, one belonging to the Sayr HaMishtaleach, and one belonging to the Mitzora. Okay? So the Gemara said, let's start on the bottom of Mem Aleph Amud Beis, so 41b at the very last line. Ki asa Ravan Pirsha Mishmeidu Rabbi Yonasan. Ravan explained in the name of Rabbi Yonasan, going on to 42a at the top. Shel Para Mishkal Asara Zuz. That of the Para had the weight of 10 zuz. And Rashi explains because it has to be, it had to be heavy so that it would sink into the fire, into the flames. So Shel Sayra Mishtaleach Mishkal Shnei Selayim. That of the Sayr HaMishtaleach, the goat that was sent away, was 2 sela. And Rashi explains because it has to be big enough to be split in half. V'shel Mitzora Mishkal Shekel. But that of the Mitzora, a shekel is sufficient. That of the Mitzora, a shekel is sufficient so that because it doesn't have any of these restrictions, doesn't have any of these obligations. Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Pligi bar Rabbi Shimon ben Chalafta v'Rabbanan. Rabbi Yochanan reports that actually this is the subject of a dispute between Rabbi Shimon ben Chalafta and the Chachamim. Para, they argue regarding the Para Aduma. Chad Amar Mishkal Asara. One says it needs to be Chad Amar Mishkal. Chad Amar Mishkal shekel, and one says it only has to be a shekel. The Simnach. And the siman for us to recall, for us to remember, that this machlokes was regarding 10 shekel and 1 shekel, as opposed to the middle opinion that says 2 sela, is echad hamarbe ve'echad hamamit. One says it has to be the most, one said it has to be the little, the least amount. It's paraphrasing a Mishnah in Menachos, where the Mishnah says that whether one gives the most or whether one gives the smallest amount, it is sufficient regarding a korban that's brought. So we paraphrase that statement and we use it here to say one is the opinion that it has to be the largest amount, one is the opinion that it has to be the smallest amount, but nobody holds the middle. Amalei Rabbi Yirmiyah midifti l'Ravina, Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Difti said to Ravina, no, you got it. You got it wrong. Lo b'para pligi, ela b'sayr hamishtalech pligi. The argument was not about the para aduma, rather it was about the sayr hamishtalech, the goat which is sent away. Ve'ahu yoma nach nafshe de Ravya bar Kisi. And on that day that there was this dispute, Ravya bar Kisi, Rashi says it was one of the Talmidei Chachamim at that time. He passed away. And we give it the siman to recall, to remember this. Ravya bar Kisi mechaper kesayra mishtalech. Ravya bar Kisi, his passing away, his death was a kapara, is an atonement, just like the sayra mishtalech. So that's how we recall that the machlokas was regarding the sayra mishtalech. Amar of Yitzchak, shtei shchitos shamati. Rav Yitzchak reported, I heard regarding the halacha regarding 2 shchitos. Achas shel paro v'achas shel paro. One regarding the para aduma and one regarding the par shel Aaron, the par kohen gadol that was brought on Yom Kippur. So the par that we've discussed several times that the kohen gadol himself brought on Yom Kippur. Achas keshera bezar, the achas pesula bezar. About one of them I heard that it's kosher even if the shchita was done by a non-kohen. And one I heard is psula by a non-kohen, and I don't know which one is which. So the Gemara is going to
Gary, you might want to mute.
The Gemara is going to try and figure out which one is which. Itma shchitas paro uparo. So the shchita of the para aduma and the shchita of the par kohen gadol. Rav Shmuel. It's a machlokas between Rav and Shmuel. Chan Amar para psula. Paro keshera. Chad Amar paro psula paro keshera. So one says that the paraduma would be puzzle if it was done by a zar, by a non-Kohen, and however, the par of the Kohen Gadol would be kosher even if the shechita was done by a non-Kohen. And one says the opposite: the par Kohen Gadol would be puzzle, the paraduma would be kosher. So the Gemara says, to stayim, we should assume the Rav Huda Amar para psula. Rav should be the one who holds that the paraduma is puzzle, is invalid if it was done by a non-Kohen. The Amar Rav Zera, shchitas para bizar pisula, because Rav Zera said that the shchita of the paraduma by a zar, by a non-Kohen, is puzzle. The Amar Rav Allah, and Rav himself explained this statement. So you see that it's Rav who is explaining it. So Rav obviously holds of this opinion. Rav said, Elazar v'chuka shaninu bar. So Rav explained the reason why it's puzzle is normally shchita of a korban does not have to be done by a kohen. Shchita of a korban can be done by anyone. However, in the case of the paraduma, it says Elazar HaKohen should be the one to do it, and it says the word chuka. And anytime it says the word chuka, it's a law, then that teaches us that everything about it is ma'akev. Everything about it can render it invalid if it's not done precisely the way the Torah says that it has to be. So since it says Elazar and it says chuka, therefore it's an exception from the normal rule, and it would be puzzle if it was done by a zar. So the Gemara is going to question this statement, but regardless, we see that Rav was the one who explained the statement of Reb Zera, so clearly Rav is of the opinion that the paraduma would be puzzle. So says the Gemara, Rav Maishna para dichsiv Elazar v'chuka. So Rav is of the opinion that the paraduma was puzzle because it says Elazar v'chuka. However, the par of the Kohen Gadol would be kosher. So asks the Gemara, Paro nami haksiv Aaron v'chuka. So by the par Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur as well, it says Aaron has to be the one to do the avoda, and it uses the word chuka by Yom Kippur as well. So if it uses the word chuka, that should teach us that the shchita, if it was done by a non-Kohen, would be ma'akev, would be rendered invalid. So what's the difference? What is the distinction between the paraduma and the par Kohen Gadol? So answers the Gemara, a very interesting answer. Shchita lav avoda hi. Shchita is not considered an avoda. Shchita is not considered one of the avodas of of korbanos, of kachim, and therefore, even though it says Aaron has to be the one to do all of the avoda on Yom Kippur, and it says the word chuka, which tells me that everything regarding these avoda is ma'akev, would render it invalid. Nevertheless, it would not apply to shchita because shchita is not actually considered an avoda. Now, there's an interesting distinction between Rashi and Tosfos. Rashi is of the opinion in many places. Rashi says shchita lav avoda hi. The reason why we know that shchita is not considered an avoda is because it's kosher if it was done by a zar, by a non-kohen. Now, Tosfos really questions this because that seems to be our question itself. That the reason why it's kosher by a zar is because it's not an avoda. So it seems to be some sort of circular logic, circular reasoning. So Tosfos says a different opinion, and Tosfos says the reason why shchita is not an avoda is because shchita applies to all animals, even regarding one which is not a korban. Right? We know that any animal, even chulin, has to have shchita. So therefore, since shchita is something which is universal, it's not special to, it's not limited to kachim. Therefore, we can say that shchita is not an avoda, and that's why it would be kosher if it was done by anyone, even a non-kohen. So that's Tosfos' explanation. So the Gemara is saying that even though all the avoda of Yom Kippur has to be done by the Kohen Gadol, however, this halacha does not apply to shchita. Because shchita is not considered an avoda, so the shchita can be done by a non-kohen. Now asks the Gemara, if that's the case, that shchita is not an avoda, so by paraduma we should apply the same rule, right? Why would we say that it's ma'akev by paraduma? So says the Gemara, ihachi paranami. If that's the case, then by the paraduma as well, we should say if shchita is not an avoda, right? Although the Torah said it has to be done by Elazar and it's a chuka, Nevertheless, that those halachos should not apply to the shchita because shchita is not an avoda. So the Gemara says a very interesting answer. Shani para the koche bedek habayisi. So the Gemara says that the para aduma is not a korban like any other korban. As we know, there are several glaring discrepancies in the para aduma, mainly that it's brought outside the Beit HaMikdash. Right? No other korban is brought outside the Beit HaMikdash. Not only is no other korban brought outside the Beit HaMikdash, but it's an Isser Kares. Right? It's a lav in the Torah that we're forbidden to bring a korban outside the Beit HaMikdash. Right? So therefore, the Gemara in several places says that the para aduma did not have the actual kedusha of a standard korban. It's not what we would call kadshe mizbeach, which means it's a korban to go on the mizbeach. But rather its kedusha was relegated to the status of bedek habayis, meaning it belonged to Hegdish. But it's like other things that would be donated to Hegdish, just like any sort of money that would be donated to Hegdish, which goes towards what we call bedek habayis, the fixing of the house of the Beis Hamikdash, but it doesn't have the status of a korban. Now, what does that do for us? So the Gemara is going to explain that even though, the Rashi and Tosfos explain that even though it doesn't have the status of a korban, so the regular halachos of korban don't apply to it. Okay? So therefore, if it says Elazar and it says Chukah regarding the para aduma, okay, then that means it's going to apply to everything that's related to the para aduma. Okay, and it's not, you won't have the exception of shchita because the exception of shchita applies to that of kadshe mizbeach, applies to the rules that apply to karbonos. Okay, 1 second. So it applies to the rules that apply to karbonos. However, something which is not a korban, we're on Mem Beis Amud Aleph, about halfway down. So it applies to rules that apply to karbonos. So when it comes to a korban, we can say that it says Aaron, it says Chukah, and that applies only to things which are considered an avoda of a korban. But para aduma has no such rules of korbanos. It has an entirely different set of rules because it's not actually an avoda, it's not actually a korban. So therefore, we have no reason to distinguish between shchita versus any other part of the avoda of the para aduma, because clearly it's operating on an entirely different set of rules. And therefore, shchita is going to be ma'akev, even shchita is going to be ma'akev by the para aduma. So the Gemara is going to question this. The Gemara says it should be a kal v'chomer, v'lav kol dekenu, that it should be a kal v'chomer, that if something which is bedek habayis, which is normally we assume that to be on a lower stature, a lower level than that of kadshe mizbeach, than that of a korban which is brought on the mizbeach. So if we're going to say that the shchita of a zar would be invalid, would be puzzle, even on bedek habayis, so then all the more so that it should be puzzle by the par kohen gadol, by a korban which is brought inside the Beis Hamikdash, that should be on a higher level of kedusha. So Amar of Shisha Bredo of Idi, Midi dahava amaros negoyim, the lavavodahi ubayi kuhuna. So he says that this kal v'chomer is not absolute because we find there are other cases where you can have something which is not an avoda, and nevertheless it has to be done by a kohen. Where do we find that? So we find the halacha regarding tsaras. If a person has what may or may not be a nega tsaras, so he has to show it to the kohen, and the kohen is the one who decides whether or not this is considered tsaras. Now, who does it have to be shown to? To a kohen. Only to a kohen. No one else has the ability to decide on tsaras, even though it's not an avoda. Certainly not an avoda in the Beis Hamikdash. Nevertheless, the Torah says that only a kohen could be the one to do so. So you see that there are times when you need a kohen, okay, even though something is not an avoda. Okay, so therefore, right, it's not strange for us to say that para aduma is not considered an avoda. It's not considered like kadshe mizbeach, and nevertheless you'll need a kohen. Okay, and therefore, and we don't have to say that if that's the case, then automatically by the par kohen gadol we should apply the same halacha. It's not necessarily the case, because you see that by maros negoyim we require a kohen, and that doesn't mean by everything else in the Beis Hamikdash we're going to require a kohen. Now, so that's the opinion of Rav, that para aduma is going to be puzzle if the shchita is by a zar, whereas the par kohen gadol is going to be kosher, even if the shechita was by a zar. Now the Gemara is going to go to the other opinion, the opinion of Shmuel, who holds the reverse. Well, the Shmuel de Amar paro psula. So Shmuel holds that the par kohen gadol is pasul if it was done by a zar, if it was done by a non-kohen, whereas the paraduma is kosher. So the Gemara is going to explain Shmuel's statement. Maishna paro d'chsiv Aaron v'chuka. So why is the par kohen gadol? Why is that pasul? Because it says that all the avodah has to be done by Aaron, and it says chuka by Yom Kippur, and that teaches us that any halacha relating to the avodah of Yom Kippur is ma'akev, would render it invalid if it wasn't done properly. Paranami haksiv elazar v'chuka. Right? By paraduma, it also says that it has to be done by Elazar, and it says the word chuka, so there too it should render it invalid if it wasn't done by a kohen. Answers the Gemara Shani Hasam Dichsiv V'Shachat Osa Lifanav. Regarding the paraduma, it says that it should be slaughtered before Elazar, before the kohen. Okay, so from there we see that we can extrapolate, we can learn out that the shechita is not being done by the kohen himself, because it sounds like the pasuk is saying V'Shachat Osa Lifanav, that it should be slaughtered before the kohen. Sounds like it's not the kohen who's actually doing the slaughtering, because if the kohen was doing the slaughtering, we don't have to say lifanav, that it should be done before him, right? If he's the one doing the shechita, obviously it's being done before him, right? So if the Torah has to tell us lifanav, before him, okay, then clearly that's teaching us that he's not the one doing the shechita. So we explain that shehezar shochet ve'elazar roa, that that teaches us that a zar, a non-kohen, can be doing the shechita, and Elazar has to be overseeing it. So Elazar has to be watching, he has to be supervising, but he does not have to be the one to do the shechita. That's the opinion of Shmuel. So now the Gemara obviously has to explain Rav, who disagrees with this, right? So how does Rav explain the pasuk b'shachat osa lefanav? The Rav shalo yasiach daito mimena. Rav says that the reason why it says lefanav is not to tell us that he's not the one doing the avodah. Okay, certainly, Elazar has to be the one doing the avodah. Lefanav is teaching me that he has to put all his concentration, his focus, has to be on the korban which is before him. So he is the one doing the shechita, and lefanav teaches me that his focus has to be on this korban, that he should not be distracted by anything else while he's doing the shechita, while he's doing the avodah. That he cannot take his mind off the korban even for a moment. He can't be distracted by anything else. Ushmuel where does Shmuel learn out this halacha? Because Shmuel agrees to this halacha that if the kohen is distracted even for a moment, it would render the paraduma invalid. What is his source for this halacha? Nafkalei mevisaraf es hapara le'enav. So he learns it out from a later pasuk where it says that the paraduma has to be burned before the kohen, right? And from there he learns out that it says before the kohen, that the kohen has to have all of his concentration, his focus on the korban that's before him.
That's a deviation from what the shot is of the fanav. The fanav is in front of him versus having all his attention on it, right?
Exactly. So we're saying that lefanav does not mean to say that the kohen is only supervising, right? Rather, the kohen himself has to be the one doing it, in which case we have to wonder, what is lefanav telling us, right? If it's, what does it mean before him? If he's the one doing the avodah, of course it's before him. He's the one doing it, right? So we're explaining that lefanav means that he has to put his focus solely on this korban, and that is the halacha. If he's distracted, even momentarily, by anything else, if he turns to do something else, if he goes to check his phone in the middle, the paraduma would be pasul. Exactly. So v'Rav chad b'shchita v'chad b'sreifa. Now Rav says that we actually need the Torah to write lefanav 2 times. It has to write it regarding the shchita, and it has to write it regarding the sreifa, regarding the burning of the korban as well. Utzricha, and I need the Torah to tell it to me twice. Because of rachmana b'shchita mishum d'tchilas avodahi. If the Torah would only have written it regarding shchita, so then I might have said, by shchita, it needs his entire focus, because that's the very beginning of the avodah. So the avodah has to get started properly. It has to get started on the right foot. So you have to do it with his full focus. Aval sreifa emalo, but perhaps by the time you get to the burning, so even if he's not fully focused on it, it would still be kosher. So therefore, you need the Torah to tell it to me twice. Because of Rahmana b'Sreifa, if the Torah had only written it by Sreifa, mishum dahashta hu the miskashra para, because this is the moment that the paraduma becomes what we need. It becomes the ashes that we're going to use for the actual tahara, for the actual process of becoming tahar. So since this is the moment that it actually becomes ashes. Therefore, now you'll need the focus. Aval shchita emalo, but perhaps by shchita it would be valid even without his focus. Tzricha, therefore you need the Torah to write it twice, once by shchita and once by sreifa. So it says the Gemara, lemute mai. This that the Torah writes that you need your focus by the shchita and you need your focus or the focus of the Kohen by the sreifa, by the burning. What is that excluding? Meaning there are certain times where we'll say that even if the Kohen did not have his entire focus on the parah, it's going to be kosher. When are those times? If you'll tell me that it's referring to when the Kohen is gathering, when they're gathering the ashes of the parah aduma and they are filling the water in the vessels for the water to be used, for the ashes to be sprinkled on that water, and then for that water to be sprinkled on the person who's tameh. So when we're filling up the water for the carbon, you'll tell me that perhaps then we don't require the focus of the person who's doing those actions. So going on to Mem Beis, Amud Beis, onto 42b, Lemishmeres Lemei Nidaksiv. But the Torah writes that it has to be for a safeguard, for a watching of the Mei Nida, which is referring to the water of the parah aduma. Okay, so since it says that it has to be for a safeguard of the waters of the parah aduma, that teaches us that anything related to the waters of the parah aduma until the time that they're being used to sprinkle on the person who's tameh, anything related to those waters requires safeguarding, requires watching, meaning it requires the focus of the person who's doing those actions. So it can't be that that's what the Torah is excluding, that it's kosher even without focus, even without concentration, because lemishmeres lemei nida teaches me that it requires focus. Ella lemute hashlachas eitz erez ve'ezov ushni tolas. Rather, it is referring to the avodah when they throw in the eitz erez, the piece of cedar wood, and the ezov, the grass or the vegetation that's thrown in, ushni tolas, and the red string that's thrown into the burning of the parah aduma, into the fire of the parah aduma, the lavgufa de parahi, that although the Torah requires it, right, it's not a part of the parah aduma itself. Right? It's something extraneous. It's outside of the parah aduma. So there, even if it was done without the complete focus, without the complete concentration of the person who's throwing it in, nevertheless, it would still be kosher, would not render the parah aduma invalid because it's not a part of the parah of the animal itself. Okay, the Gemara now continues.
That red wool, is that where they get the little strings that they hand out?
I don't know if that's the source. I don't know if that's the source for it. They claim for it to have a Kabbalistic source. I don't know if it's connected at all. I don't know. So the Gemara continues. Itmar shchitas para bizar. So regarding the shchita of the parah aduma by Azar, Rav Ami Amar Kshera, Rav Yitzchak Nafcha Amar Psula. Rav Ami said that it's kosher. Rav Yitzchak Nafcha reported that it's pasul. Ula Amar Kshera. Ula said that it's kosher. Rav Ami La Psula. However, some report that Ula reported that it's pasul. So not a very unequivocal statement there. Some say Ula said kosher. Some say Ula said pasul. Okay, Masiv Rabbi Yeshua bar Abba l'siyue de Rav. So Rabbi Yeshua bar Abba posed a question on Shmuel to bring a proof to Rav. So he's quoting a statement and he's going to use that as a proof. So Ainli Ella Hazas Memeha She'ein Ksherin Be'isha Kibe'ish Ve'ein Ksherin Ella B'yom. So we have a discussion here to learn out the halacha. Whether or not some of these avodas can be done at night, or whether they are limited to the daytime, that they can only be done in the daytime. So he says that hazas memeha, the sprinkling of the water, that is is not kosher if it's done by a woman. It requires a man. And Rashi explains because it's a pasuk. The pasuk says, "V'taval b'mayim ish tahor." Says that an ish has to be the one to do it. It has to be a man doing it, and therefore it's not kosher if it was done by a woman. And it says that it has to be done during the daytime, right? So we see that. So the Gemara is making a connection that something which is pasul if it's done by a woman, so there the Torah requires it to be done in the daytime. Minayin l'rabos. How do we know to include shchitasa, v'kabalas dama, v'hazas dama, usreifasa, v'hashlachas eitz eres, v'ezo v'shni tolas? How do we know to include the other avodas of the paraduma? So the shchita of the paraduma, kabalas dama, catching the blood, v'hazas dama, and sprinkling the blood towards the Beis Hamikdash, usreifasa, and burning the para, v'hashlachas eitz eres, v'ezo v'shni tolas, and throwing into the fire the cedar wood and the azov, the grass, and the red wool.
Sorry, is each ever a general term like mankind is both inclusive of men and women?
Sometimes, and sometimes the Gemara knows. It's a good question. Sometimes the Gemara will say that ish is just a reference. It's a term, right, that we're using, and sometimes the Gemara will learn out that ish is ma'akev. So I think when it comes to avoda in the Beis Hamikdash, the Gemara is assuming that ish is referring to only a man, and it's a limitation, man and not a woman. Whereas in other places, we'll say that it can mean even a woman. Yeah. So I don't know exactly when we draw the line, when we don't. Yeah, it's an interesting question. Yeah. Okay. So yeah, it's an interesting question. I'm not entirely sure. So the Gemara's question now is, how do you know that the other avoda of the shchita and kabbalas dama, all of these avoda can only be done during the daytime? Talmud lomar Torah. So therefore the Torah said Torah achas, that it's all one set of halachos. So if this halacha applies by one, then it's going to apply by all the others as well. Yochol shani marba afasifas afra umiloi mayim v'kiddush. Perhaps I should also include the collecting of the ashes of the para and filling up the water for the kiddush, that should also only be valid. Talmud lomar zos. It says zos haTorah. So these are the halachos. So it's excluding certain things. It's including some, and it's excluding others. Now, obviously, the Gemara is going to ask, how do you know what to include? How do you know what to exclude? So umar rois l'rabos es elu l'hotzi es elu. So how do you know which ones to include, which ones to exclude? So achar sheriba hakasu umiyet. Since the achar shemiyet hakasu umiyet, since the Torah says the Torah uses the words Torah to include some of the avoda, and it uses the word zos to exclude other parts of the avoda. How do you know which parts to include and which parts to exclude? Right? Amrit. So we'll say right. All of it is being learned out from the sprinkling of the water on the person who is tameh. Ma hazas memeha einon ksherin beisha kibeish. So just like the hazah of the water can only be done by a man, it can't be done by a woman, again because it says va'asaf ish tahor. Ve'ein ksherin ela bayom, and it's only kosher if it's done during the daytime. Afani avish shechitasa v'kabalas dama v'hazaz dama usreifasa v'ashlachas eitz eres v'ezo v'shni tolas. Therefore, I'm going to include all the other halachos, all the other avodas of shchita, and collecting the blood and sprinkling the blood, and the burning of the para, and throwing in the cedar wood and the grass and the red wool. Hoil ve'ein be'isha kibe'ish, since they too are only kosher if done by a man, they're not kosher if done by a woman. So ein ksherin ela b'yom, they too we're going to learn out that they would only be kosher if they're done during the daytime. Not if they're done at night, to the exclusion umotziani asifas afra umilu mayim v'kiddush, and it's excluding collecting the ashes and filling up the water for the kiddush. Hayuluk sherin beisha kibeish, since those can be done by a woman, so therefore ksherin nami bayom ubalayla, they're going to be kosher during the day and during the nighttime. Now, how is that relevant to us? Because the Gemara said that shchita is pasul if it's done by a woman. right? That was part of our source. We said that shchita, along with the other things, is puzzle if done by a woman. Now, why would shchita be puzzle if it's done by a woman? Only because it has to be done by a kohen, right? If we're going to say that a non-kohen is able to do shchita if it's kosher with a zar, then there's no distinction between a man or a woman. A woman can do shchita just like a man can do shchita. Okay, so there's no reason to exclude a woman more than anyone else. Okay, so the only reason why we would say that a woman's shchita would be invalid is only because so would a man's shchita if he's not a kohen. Okay, so the only reason again that the woman would be excluded is if it requires a kohen. So therefore, this is a proof to Rav that the paraduma requires a kohen, because otherwise the shchita of the woman would be kosher as well. So, Vahai, my tiyufta. Says, what type of question is this? So perhaps you'll tell me that, again, like we just said, that you're assuming that since it's puzzle if it's done by a woman, it will be puzzle if it's done by a zar, by anyone who's not a kohen. That's not an absolute statement, because we find by the sprinkling of the water on the person who's tameh that a woman is excluded, right? It says it has to be done by a man, right? But it doesn't have to be done by a kohen. Shepsulin be'isho ksherin bizar. So you see that there are halachos regarding paraduma, which it requires a man, but it does not require a kohen. So Amar Abaye hainu tiyufte. Abaye says, I'll explain the question. Isha my taima. Why is it that a woman is excluded? Elazar velo isha. Right? Only because it says that it has to be done by Elazar, right? And Elazar was a male, so therefore it has to be done by a male, not by a woman. Zar nami Elazar velo zar. So by that rule, we should exclude a zar, a non-kohen as well, because if the Torah specifies it has to be done by Elazar was a kohen, so therefore a zar should be excluded.
Zar is just a non-kohen. That's all a zar is.
A zar is a non-kohen, correct? Anyone who's not a kohen. The zar comes from the word zar, means a stranger. So regarding the avoda, and he's a stranger to the avoda in the Beis Hamikdash. So that's the term that the Torah uses. V'azar akaret yumas. Amar ula kol parsha kula mashma motzi miyad mashma umashma mimela. So Ula says that there are in this entire parsha of paraduma in the Torah, there are some contradictions, right? Where the Torah seems to contradict itself, and in certain statements we're going to keep it exactly the way it's written in the pasuk, and in certain cases we're going to say that one pasuk actually will change the halacha of the pasuk before it. So what are these examples? Unasatim osa le'elazar hakohen, osa le'elazar v'lo ledoros le'elazar. So the Torah says that you should give it to Elazar the Kohen, and Asatim Osa. You should give it, and normally when the Torah writes the word Osa, it's an exclusion to the exclusion of something else. Okay, so we learn out you give it to Elazar Kohen, and however in future generations, so this paraduma that was done in the Midbar, that was done in the desert, it's called the Parah of Moshe, that one has to be given to Elazar, to the exclusion of later generations, that in later generations it doesn't have to be given to Elazar HaKohen.
Meaning it's that specific korban.
Exactly. The one that the Torah is referring to, this specific one that the Torah is referring to, the one that was done in the Midbar, in the desert, right? That one has to be given to Elazar to the exclusion of later ones that does not have to be given to Elazar. Okay. Now, what exactly does that mean? What's the exclusion coming to tell me? What does that tell me? Ika da amri. Some say ledoros bekoin gadol. Ika da amri ledoros bekoin hedyot. So Elazar is who we refer to as the skan kohen gadol. He's the second. He's the assistant kohen gadol. He was the second to Aaron. Obviously, to Aaron, his father. Aaron was the kohen gadol. Elazar was what we refer to as the skan kohen gadol. And yet the Torah specifies Elazar HaKohen, that it had to be done by Elazar, not by Aaron. That it was done by the skan. Now, we're saying that is a limited halacha only to that specific parah. That one has to be done by the skan, but in future generations, it's not going to be done by the skan, by the assistant kohen gadol. Now, who is it going to be done by? So we have two opinions. One says that we're going to go up a level. One says we'll go down a level. So one says that the Parah Aduma in the desert was limited to Elazar, to the Skan, but in future generations, it's going to have to be done by the Kohen Gadol himself. Okay? So we're going to go up a level. And the other opinion says, no, we'll go down a level. It's teaching me that in future generations, any Kohen can be the one to do it. It doesn't have to be the Skan Kohen Gadol. It could be done by anyone. Any Kohen would be valid for it. So the Gemara says, Bishlema.
Just those two. Either you go up, you stay the same, or you go down. Those are three different options, right?
No, we don't stay the same because we have the limitation of Osa. Only this para is done by Elazar. All other paras, all future para adumas, right, will not have the halacha of Elazar because then you wouldn't have the limitation. It should have just said unesatem le'Elazar HaKohen. Give the para to Elazar, right? Unesatem already means give it, right? It already means give. So obviously I know unesatem means give, right? You should give it. Now obviously I know it's referring to the para, right? To the para aduma.
It necessarily excludes just staying the same.
Exactly. So either you go up a level or you go down a level, right? So one opinion says you go up, one opinion says you go down. So the Gemara says, Bishlam alamanda amar ledoros bekohen hedyod shapir. So if you say it goes down a level to the kohen hedyod, so then it makes sense. Alamanda amar ledoros bekohen gadol, ledoros bekohen gadol minale. So the opinion to say it goes down a level, so that makes sense to say you have an exclusion. Right. This one, the Torah is specifying Elazar, but in other korbanos, everything would be anyone would be any Kohen, I should say. I'm sorry, any Kohen would be kosher. Right. So that makes sense because normally when the Torah has an exclusion, it's to go down a level to say that in future generations, right, it would be a lesser requirement. Right. But what would be the opinion to say that you go up a level to say it's only by the Kohen Gadol? It's rare that will have an exclusion in the Torah to teach me that the next one is actually going to be more stringent than the one that we're actually discussing. So the Gemara says, Gomar chuka chuka miyom haKippurim. So we're going to learn out from Yom Kippur. It says the word chuka by paraduma. It says the word that this is a chuka achas. It's a law in the Torah, and anytime it says chuka, we say that it means everything, every halacha is necessary. And by Yom Kippur, it also says chukah. So we're going to learn out a gezerah shava, just like by Yom Kippur, all the avoda has to be done by the Kohen Gadol. So too, by the paraduma, it's going to have to be done by the Kohen Gadol. So even though it's rare, it's a rarity for the Torah to have an exclusion that teaches us to actually make the next one more stringent. Nevertheless, that's going to be the halacha in this case, that according to this opinion, right, then the avoda of the paraduma in subsequent and future generations has to be done by the Kohen Gadol. V'hotzi osa shelo yotzi acheres ima. So this is the next part of the pasuk. It says you should take it out. You should take the paraduma. V'hotzi osa. Again, the word osa is superfluous. It's extra. So it's an exclusion. It's telling me that when you take out the paraduma, so it means that there was a process. They would take it out from in the midbar. They took it out from the Mishkan. In future generations, they took it out from the Beis Hamikdash. They would bring it. It was done on Har Hazesim, adjacent, across from the Beis Hamikdash. So when you take it out, so if the parad, let's say it doesn't want to walk, so animals can be stubborn, be obstinate. Let's say it refuses to walk, to move. So you might think that what do? You bring another cow, and when the other cow starts walking, this one will follow, right? So you're not allowed to do that. Shelo yotzi acheres ima. You're not allowed to bring out another cow and have it walk along with it to get this cow to move. Kidetnan, like we learned in the Mishnah. This is the Mishnah in Para. Lo hoisa para rotza latzes. If the para does not want to walk, ein motziin ima shechora. You're not allowed to bring out a black cow, meaning a darker cow, a cow which is not red. Shelo yomu shechora shachtu. Because people might see, right, and they'll see you bringing out in the procession. They'll see you walking with the black cow, meaning a cow which is not red, and they'll say that even a black cow is kosher for paraduma. Ve'ein motziin ima aduma shelo yomu shtayim shachtu. And you cannot bring out, even if you were to find another one which is red, you're not allowed to bring that one out along with it, because people might say that they shechted two of them at the same time. Okay, and that would be invalid because, like we said earlier, we need the focus, the concentration of the Kohen to be on the para aduma. Okay, and it's impossible for a person to focus fully on two animals at the same time. Okay, so since it requires his full focus, you can only do one at a time. So if you did two, it would be puzzle, right? So that too would be a problem. So Rabbi Omer lo min Hashem hu zeh, elo mishum shenemar osa livada. So Rebbe says that no, we don't have to give any explanation for why you can't bring out another one with it, right? The reason why you can't bring out another cow with it is because the Torah said, "Osa, bring out it," and that teaches us it has to be alone, it has to be by itself. Now, what's the difference between these two opinions, right? Who cares what the reason is, right? Either way, we're coming out to the same conclusion. So, what's the difference? What the reason is? So, v'tanakama haksiv osa. Right, and regarding Tanakama, it says Osa. So why does he feel the need to give an explanation for why you can't bring out another animal? Right, let it suffice to say the Torah said you can't bring out another animal with it. Why does he have to explain? Because people might become confused and they'll think that the other animal would be brought out together with it. So answers the Gemara, Man Tanakama Reb Shimon he the Dorish Taima Dekra. So the other opinion is Reb Shimon, the Tanakama is Reb Shimon, who says that we can explain why the Torah says a certain thing, that we can give explanation to why the Torah gives a halacha in certain cases. There might be a logical explanation behind it, and we can use that logical explanation to actually extrapolate, to learn out other things from this. And we'll probably have to continue with this tomorrow, but basically Reb Shimon says that the Torah says that do not take a mashkon. Don't take a mashkon, what's the word again? When you take a loan, a collateral. Don't take. Thank you. Don't take. I didn't have my coffee yet. Okay. Don't take collateral from a poor. I'm sorry. Don't take collateral from an almana, from a widow. Okay. Now, why can't you take collateral from a widow? So the Torah says, don't do it. Okay, so if the Torah says don't do it, then you can't do it, right? But Reb Shimon says, no, there's an explanation behind it, okay? Because the Torah teaches us that if you take collateral from a poor person, you have to return it to them each day. You're not allowed to keep the collateral of the poor person. You have to return it to him, that he should have it at the end of the day. And what's going to happen if you return this collateral to this widow and you're seen going in and out of her house on a constant basis, okay? So it's going to give her a bad reputation. Right? People are going to say that clearly she has a relationship with this man because she's constantly seen going in and out of her house. So therefore, the Torah says you cannot take a mashkon, you cannot take a collateral from a widow. Now, who cares? Because it matters. Let's say the widow is quite wealthy. Right? In that case, you don't have to return the collateral to her constantly on a constant basis. So in that case, says Reb Shimon, you would be allowed to take the collateral from her. Because the only reason the Torah said not to take it, right, is because you're going to give her a bad reputation by going in and out of her house. Right?
Who a bad reputation? You.
The widow.
Why a widow? It's you. You're married.
But it's what you choose to do is your own choice. But the Torah is saying that she is beholden to you because you're the one who is lending her the money, right? And you're going to be given.
About the loan, or?
No, the bad reputation about we'll assume that she has a relationship with this man, right? Because he's seen going in and out of her house. What? But even so, right. So, so therefore, Reb Shimon says we can learn out that by a wealthy woman where this rule doesn't apply, it would be permitted, right? Okay, so we'll continue with this. We'll pick up with this tomorrow. Okay. Yeah.